Right, it's 4 o'clock, ready to rock and roll. So thank you for joining us this afternoon. For those of you who I have not met yet, my name is Eamon Chandel, and I am head of events and also look after conference partnerships at Women in Mining UK. You may also know me from the Oxford Mining Club and the Natural Resources Forum. So a big welcome to you. I'm just going to run through a few housekeeping points. So if you could be so kind to keep your mics on mute, that would be greatly appreciated. You will see your cameras have been turned off as we are following a traditional webinar format. Please direct all your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we are recording today's webinar, so please check back on our website for the link in a couple of days. So to start us off, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Sarah Gordon. Having completed her PhD at Imperial College, Sarah then went on to work as a geologist for Anglo American. She was lucky enough to live and work in Canada, Brazil, Southern Africa, and Europe, fabulous places, in a variety of functions, from exploration through to sustainability, risk management, and assurance. This grounding allowed her to explore different risk management techniques and uses, applying them to real situations. Sarah then co-founded SATARLA in 2014, and now with 80 associates based around the world and offices in London, Sydney, Johannesburg, and soon Toronto, SATARLA provides risk management consultancy, training, and research to organizations from sectors such as healthcare, agriculture, charities, finance, together with petrochemicals, energy, oil and gas, and of course, mining. And Sarah is an honorary lecturer at Imperial College London and a research associate at the University of Johannesburg, and voted as one of the 100 global inspirational women in mining in the 2016 edition of WIM 100. She is also a trustee of Geology for Global Development. We're absolutely delighted to be partnering with SATARLA on this 3-part webinar series. And now I would like to hand over to Sarah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Eamon. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with everybody today. I'm dialing in here from my office in London, but of course, usually I would be sitting somewhere a bit more similar to hopefully the slide that you guys can now see. I spend most of my life out and about, somewhere close or nearby various different mine sites, just to prove that yes, I do tend to wear a hard hat on a regular basis. So that's usually where I'm at. But of course, over the last few months, my particular engagement with a lot of our clients has been a little bit more like this. This is a photograph from yesterday where we were running some risk training workshops with an operation in Canada, where they, of course, were all together because in Newfoundland, they've actually beginning to come out of lockdown. But of course, all of my SATARLA team were working remotely with them. So I think this hopefully goes to show that even if you work on the more technical side of mining, COVID hasn't stopped everything. It is still very possible for us to use different tools and techniques in order to be able to get on with our lives. So with regards to today and an introduction to mining for non-technical specialists, or a bit of mining 101, there is a huge amount of information that I could share with you today, but don't worry, I'm going to keep it swift, I'm going to keep it to the point, and hopefully really interesting for you. As Eamon said, please do use the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. We will leave time for questions at the end of the session, and any questions that we don't manage to answer live during this forum, we will be able to get back to you over the course of the next week. Now, some of you may have already seen the fact sheet that would have been available via various different links. If you haven't got this, then please do go to the website. So go to the SATARLA website. You'll also be able to get through to it, I'm sure, through various links on the Women in Mining website. But this little fact sheet here takes you through some of the key aspects of mining. So if you walk away from today's brief session with nothing else, then this little fact sheet here is a good one to have in your back pocket, as it takes you through some of the key different concepts within mining. It takes you through some of the key words in mining, and also the high level process flow of what we do from a technical side of the organization. Now, to start with, we've been mining for a very, very long time. So human beings have been extracting rocks and minerals from our earth for an incredibly long time. And the way in which we do it, to be honest, hasn't really changed all that much in quite a long period of time. Yes, we've made fantastic advances with regards to development in technology, but the basic methods that we use are still pretty much the same. It's all about going and finding the rock that you think is valuable to you, then being able to break it apart and being able to extract the useful bits, the useful minerals, the useful elements out of it in a form that can then be used in all of our different technology, etc., that we need. But to bring it down to the basics, every successful mine needs three things. Number one, we need that useful rock in the ground that somebody wants. Number two, we need permission or a license to be able to go and do it. And number three, we need that finance as well as that demand. Okay, so those are three of the key factors that we need to come together for any successful mine. And that doesn't matter if you are one of the biggest mines in the world through to artisanal mining. You still need that ore in that ground, permission to be able to go there of some sort, and that finance behind it, so that you've got the time and the tools to be able to go and extract those minerals from the ground. Now, in terms of how do we do it? Well, as I mentioned, we've been doing it in a pretty similar way all the way through the years, but we always need those three things, even if it's from a few thousand years ago of mining all the way into the future, where yes, I do believe at some point in time we will be mining some of our asteroids, if not other planets within our solar system and beyond. We will still need the ore in the ground or something that's useful, a license to operate, and that financing and that technology, etc., behind it. So in terms of the beginning of this value chain for mining, well, it all starts off with being able to find the rocks that we need. And this starts in the world of exploration. So I started off my career as an exploration geologist, and being an exploration geologist is fantastic because you get to go exploring far remote parts of the world that it's incredibly special to be able to go and visit. And the reason why we get to go to those parts of the world is because of the geology and where the rocks are found and where they exist today. And in order to be able to understand this, we need to go all the way back to the formation of our planet, of Earth, because by understanding how Earth formed and how Earth has evolved, that then gives us an indication of where we might find the rocks in the ground that are going to be useful to us. So 4.56 billion years ago, this is what our solar system looked like, we think. We think it looked like this spinning cloud of gas and dust. This is our protoplanetary disk that over time began to condense down into the solar system that we know and we love today. And if we take a little bit of a look at Earth, what was going on with Earth was you were getting this differentiation or this fractionation or the separation of the heavier elements and the lighter elements. And it's that formed the different zones within our planet. So the core all the way through to our crust. Now within mining, we're only really interested in the outer bit of the crust because Earth's quite big, okay? And in terms of that outer mantle going up to the crust, the exciting thing for us is that we have all of these concentration mechanisms. So for example, Earth is still cooling. Because Earth is cooling, we get things like the mid-Atlantic ridge, which is therefore spreading away. And what you get then is you get these oceanic plates colliding with continental plates and being forced underneath those continental plates through subduction. And it's in these subduction zones that we get more melting of that material, and we get these great big volcanoes. So for example, here, this might be a view of Chile. So imagine we're sitting down on the South Pole and we're looking north. Okay, we're now looking at that subduction zone that's going down underneath Chile, and we get these fabulous big volcanoes. Now, it's in this part of the process that we're getting more concentration of all of those elements within our earth, and this is what then allows us to form different rock types. Okay, so for example, you have your igneous rock types. Those are the ones that you might get within volcanoes and things like that. You get your sedimentary rock types. That's where the rocks have been broken down and washed down through rivers and then laid down again. And then you get your metamorphic rocks, which is where everything has been squished together. And what we find is we need to understand what is going on with these rocks in order to then say, well, if I want to go and find some copper, where in the world should I go and take a look? So the Earth is incredibly dynamic. And as geologists, what we do is we try to understand just how dynamic the Earth is. And as exploration geologists, we then try and say, well, understanding our Earth as a system, where would we want to go if we wanted to find copper? Or where would we want to go if we wanted to find a diamond, for example? Unfortunately, we can't think, I fancy going on holiday to the Bahamas. That's not how it works, because you're not going to find much copper or many diamonds there, certainly not within the Earth. Instead, you have to go to where the Earth has naturally allowed those elements to be concentrated into levels of concentration that is economic to be able to extract from the ground. Now, the problem with the Earth is, of course, it doesn't stand still. So not only do you have this constant dynamic system that's going on, yes, it takes a very long time to do this, but in geological time period, it happens quite fast. But the Earth is constantly changing in terms of where those rocks are formed and where they stay, because we have this thing called plate tectonics. Now, what we have here is a time period that goes from the present day all the way back to 720 million years ago, which for a geologist isn't actually that long, but for most of us, trying to picture what 720 million years looks like is incredibly difficult. And actually, if I just flick through these slides here, you can see that all of the continents of Earth are moving over the surface of our planet. And as we go back in time, of course, life looks very different. Also, you can see the various graphs or wiggly lines along the bottom of this slide, where we have the temperature changing, where we have the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere changing. So everything about Earth is changing quite a lot as we go back in time. And in fact, now here we are 443 million years ago, and it's really quite difficult to work out, well, where anywhere is. It certainly doesn't look like planet Earth as we know and we love it today. So if I carry on going all the way back to 720 million years ago, that is, from a modeling perspective, what we think Earth looked like 720 million years ago. Now, if I speed forwards through time, so this is just a quick video going from 720 million years ago all the way up to the present day, you can begin to see those continents forming as we know and we love them now. The key thing with regards to geology is that many of the rocks that mining companies are currently extracting from the ground were formed 720 million years ago, or thereabouts. And so therefore what geologists are doing is, yes, they're thinking about planet Earth as it looks like this, but they're also trying to think, where was that 720 million years ago, and what were the different processes going on underneath the surface of the ground then, because it was that was forming all of those rocks and minerals, etc., that we may be extracting today. So that then gives us a map of the world that looks a bit like this. And what we can then do is say, okay, we know that we have different zones on our planet where we're more or less likely to get those minerals, those metals, those elements that we want to be able to extract. So for example, I know that if I want to go and find some copper, I might go somewhere around the Pacific Rim, for example, because I know there's subduction zones there. I also know that once upon a time there was some great stuff going on in Central Africa, etc., etc. So I know where in the world I might want to go and extract certain commodities. And that's because geologists have done their homework and they understand where a lot of these rocks come from. So what a geologist does is they do all of that background theory and that back desktop study and analysis. That is coupled with a huge amount of risk analysis that usually looks at things like country risk, political risk, etc., more of which we'll be talking about next week and the week after, when we're looking at environment, social and governance type risks, and how do you ensure that companies are truly responsible. So an exploration company will be looking at all of that, as well as where might they find the rock that they need to be able to dig out of the ground. And only at that point in time should they start going and spending proper money on really searching for the rock. And that's the point in time where we properly get into exploration. We start hiring things like helicopters. So we start hiring things like drill rigs, so we can go and start taking a look at what really might be underneath the ground. And we do it based off maps like this. So this is a slightly different version of the previous map I showed you, where you can see some of the world's key copper belts, nickel belts, zinc belts, etc., because those are the parts of the world that we go to. Now, what we do then as an exploration geologist or an exploration company is we start off with a really big area and we start to narrow it down. So we use lots and lots of different types of data sets for us to be able to say, okay, I know that I want to go to somewhere within the Chilean Andes to go and look for some copper, maybe with a bit of gold. If we're lucky, we might have some molybdenum, etc. in there as well. And you say, okay, well, where in the Andes do I want to go? Okay, so I know that there are maybe 2 belts that I could look for. Okay, well, where in which belts do I want to go and look for? How old do I think the rocks are that I want to go and have a look at? And you keep narrowing all of that down until eventually you end up with something that is more useful and something that is getting closer to being a reserve. And I'll come back to what I mean by a reserve in a second, because there is a big difference between a resource and a reserve. And it's one of the most important technical definitions that from the geological standpoint, we need to be able to understand if we're going to understand how mining works. So as a geologist, you're constantly narrowing where you think that mine could be for the future. And that mine, it might be something that's already exposed, or it might be something that is deep underground. So it might be something that is buried. And of course, if something is buried, and especially if there's no surface expression, or especially if there's no surface indicators that it might be down there, those particular ore bodies can be incredibly difficult to find. And what they require is a huge amount of different types of data being pulled together so that we can put together those models that will all suggest, yes, there could be something underneath the ground. Because at this stage of the exploration, sometimes we don't have any of that rock physically in our hands. It might just be data points. It might be using things like geophysics and geochemistry to get an indication of there being something of use deep underneath the ground. And once we've understood if we have any targets we think might be useful going after, that's when we get the drill rigs out, and that's when we start to get core out of the ground. So those long cylinders of rock that you can see in the picture in front of you right now, this is called core. And these are basically cores or boreholes, as it were, that are taken from deep underneath the ground, and they allow us to take a tiny, tiny little sample of what is down there, and so therefore get an indication of whether there's anything of value under the ground, and also whether the models that we put together were correct or not. Because geology is all about basically taking a guess at whether there is something of value underneath the ground. You never know if your model was correct until after you've mined it, after you've taken it out of the ground, because until that point in time, you will be dealing with some uncertainty as to how good your model was or might be. And this is a very crude version of one of those geological models. And you can see that they're typically colored in different colors, okay, giving hot spots as to how good the rock might be, or what sort of concentration or what sort of grade of that material might we be finding deep under the ground, or of course at a shallower level. And that takes me into this distinction between resources and reserves. Okay, so a resource is basically all of that lovely rock that you think you might have in the ground that may contain something that is of use. Okay, so the resource is that initial lump of rock or area of rock, volume of rock in the ground that you might be interested in. Okay, so for example, if we stick with copper, this would be the resource that we think might have some copper within it. Now, once you have found that resource, or you think you've got something there, it's at this point in time that we really need to be thinking more about, okay, we found some ore, we don't quite know how much there is of it yet, or what sort of concentration there is yet. Do we actually have permission to be there? And do we think that we will continue to have permission in the future, especially when we come to actually mine that area? And also, do we have the finance? Do we have the ability to spend money or be able to go and get that rock out the ground? And so if we map our resource, we can then start saying, okay, well, some of it is going to be higher grade, i.e. higher concentration. So there's going to be more copper in that rock than there would be in the lower grade area. So some of it's going to be higher grade than the full ore body or the full resource. Some of it might be deep underneath a mountain, and so therefore that's going to technically make it very, very difficult to be able to get to. Some of it might be underneath a lake or underneath a river, again, more difficult to be able to mine in that area, and you are increasing the risk of some sort of contamination, etc., of those watercourses. You may also have settlements, you may have aspects of cultural heritage, for example. You may also have some artisanal mining going on in the area. Also, you probably don't own all of the licenses for that particular package of land. Okay, so this then narrows down your area even further. And so we can start to delineate a slightly smaller area that sits within that resource, which is your reserve. So the difference between your resource and your reserve is that rock that you can actually extract from the ground. So your reserve will always be smaller than your resource. Now, lots of people come up to me and they say, I found the next biggest gold mine. And you say, great, tell me about it. And they say, well, it's the biggest resource in the world. Well, I don't really care about resources. I want to know how much of it you can actually get hold of. And in terms of actually getting hold of, it needs to be good enough quality. From a technical standpoint, you need to technically, from an engineering perspective, be able to get to it, get it out of the ground, and also be able to separate out all the useful minerals and metals from that. You need permission to be able to do it. So that's on the social, on the environmental, on the governance side of things. And of course, the commodity that you're digging out of the ground needs to be worth something. So there needs to be enough demand in the commodity market to warrant going to all of that effort. So the difference between your resource and your reserve is the resource is the basic rock that's sitting there in the ground. This is a very basic definition. Of course, they do get more detailed. And the reserve is the portion of that that you can actually extract. And so if I'm to simplify those main steps of exploration, bearing in mind that this typically takes 10 years for an organization to get through, where you're going through your initial target generation all the way through into your pre-feasibility, feasibility, actually building the mine itself and getting into that operation. That is a series of steps, generally takes about 10 years to get through. So it's not a slow process. It is a slow process. It's not a fast process. And it's a hugely expensive process, because it's only once you start to hit operation that you begin to make some money and you begin to pay some of that time back. So that takes us from finding our rock very, very quickly, finding our rock, into the project side of things. And it's that project side of things which is where you have that pre-feasibility and feasibility studies. Now, there's a whole world to explore within that. And I'm not going to go into projects in detail at all on this call this afternoon. But instead, I'm going to signpost. There are many websites that you can go to. But here we have Digby, or thedigby.com. And what Digby have is some really lovely information from around the world, and you can basically click on all those bubbles and you can drill down into lots of the different projects, and also as well operating mines around the world. And that just gives you an indication of how much stuff is going on round about us. And we can see there, we've even got some mining in the UK, which is lovely. And also some projects, of course, in the UK. So if we go from projects into mining itself, so mining is the process of extracting the useful and the not useful rock out of the ground. And by saying not useful, that's because often there'll be a huge amount of waste that you need to move in order to be able to get to the rock that you actually want. Now, there are two main forms of mining. You can also mine under the sea as well. But the two main forms are surface or open pit or open cast, and underground mining. Now, for anybody who's a miner, I'm now going to simplify mining wholeheartedly because, of course, I don't have a huge amount of time on today's call. But basically, for surface mining, this is about big holes, explosions, and big trucks. Of course, it is a bit more complicated than that. But just to show you this, so in case anybody on the call has never actually been to a mine, you can see that these trucks really are quite big. But from a surface mining perspective, I'm now going to attempt to play a video so you can see a bit more about it. And I should say that these videos are kindly provided by Anglo American. So what you can see here is the open pit mines. Most of the iron ore mines around the world tend to be open pit mines. We can also have very large copper mines. This is one up in the Chilean Andes at 4,500 meters. Also, of course, we get coal mines all over the world. For example, here's a mine in Australia. Yes, lots of them have trucks. They don't necessarily all have haul trucks, but lots of them have great big trucks that all need to be maintained and looked after because, of course, they're hugely expensive. Many of them have explosions. Not all of them are as pretty as this particular explosion or this blast. So that's what it's called when you're blasting your bench. And basically what we're doing there is we're breaking the rock up and then being able to scrape it away. So in terms of this blasting process, firstly, what we do is we drill holes into our working area or our bench. And then we very, very carefully, we charge those holes. So we put explosives down those holes. And of course, this is a very well-controlled process. We then blast, making sure that nobody is anywhere close to that blast zone. And then we load that rock that has been blown to pieces into trucks. And just to show you what all of these different places or aspects are in this picture, you can see those steps. Those are called benches. And then where our blast holes are, that's our working bench area. So we load all that rubble into a haul truck, and then the haul truck will drive it up out of the pits, and will generally then go and deposit it into either a crusher or onto a conveyor belt or something like that. So that's what open pit mining very, very, very simply maybe looks like. Now there's lots of different equipment that can be used. So this particular piece of kit here, this is the size of a house. Okay, so again, it's huge. So this is a drag line being used in a coal mine in Australia. So these pieces of equipment are very, very large indeed. And the key thing with regards to all of this is that you are moving really quite large quantities of rock when you are in an open pit mine. And the difference between open pit mining and under pit mining is basically when it comes down to the difference between that overburden and how deep that resource is. Because to get to that reserve that you're actually trying to mine, you need to strip away that overburden. So you need to take away all of that waste, and then gradually you push that mine deeper and deeper by taking away all of that material so that you can mine the red stuff that's in there, because that's the stuff that has all of your ore body within it. And there is this magic number, which is your stripping ratio, which is the ratio of the waste to the ratio of the mineral that you actually want to be mining. And at a point in time, you're going to realize that it's too expensive to be moving all of that waste body above. And you need to work out, do we now convert the mine to an underground mine, or do we try to mine in a slightly different manner? Now, with open pit mining, obviously the footprint looks very different to an underground mine. And you can see here, we've got quite a small open pit. We've got various waste dumps, etc., tailings, etc. And I'll come on to that in a second. And these are really big. We can see them from space. And increasingly now, of course, we're using satellites to actually monitor what is going on in our pits, both from a production sense, but also as well from an environmental change sense, etc. And you can see in this little movie here, that you can even see the little haul trucks, which are of course very large when they're on the ground. Where this is taken from satellite imagery. So if we move now from open pits to underground mining. Now, underground mining is a world of terminology. And also every country seems to use slightly different words in terms of the different bits of an underground mine. And I've just circled some of the ones that are kind of most important, really, or most commonly used. So your shafts, that's basically like your lift shaft. So that is generally your vertical entrance or exit into a mine. You have a decline, which is one that's just on an angle. And then you have stopes, for example, which is where you're actually mining the rock from. So an underground mine, when you're standing on the surface, doesn't actually look like very much, apart from you will probably have all of the shaft gear. So this is for the lift, sticking up above the surface. But other than that, it might not look like very much when you're on the surface of one of these underground mines. As soon as you get underground, of course, it can look quite different. And here are some pictures of some newer and some older mines. But again, just to take a proper look at this, I've got a little video for you. And so mining underground, of course, it can be very dark. But actually, especially now, many mines are fairly well lit in those working areas because, of course, from a health and safety perspective, we need to be able to see what it is that we're doing. They can be accessed via shafts or declines. For example, you get some mines that you can drive into, others which you won't be able to drive into. You can use little trains to get into them. All kinds of different mechanisms are used for you to be able to get in and out of those mines. Obviously, the most advanced mines now are fully mechanized, so you don't even need people down there, which is really, really good because they can be incredibly hazardous places to work in. This image here that you guys can see, so this is a continuous miner, and you can see it's almost just eating away at the coal. This is an underground coal mine, and the reason why it almost looks like it's painted white, the white stuff is called stone dusting, and it's used to try and dampen down the dust in a coal mine, because dust in a coal mine is bad because it can lead to explosions. Yep, of course you will have lots of conveyor belts, and as with any mine, safety is the #1 priority. Now, this is a underground platinum mine in South Africa, and you can see the shift team here. One of the things they do is they do sing to one another as well. So this is quite an old piece of footage from one of the first mines that I ever went down. And what the guys are doing here is they're singing a safety song. And you can see them doing the various actions to say, we move the rock out of the way, and if we don't do it right, we might die, which is a really good reminder of the place in which you're trying to work. I'll just let them finish. So hopefully that little video just gave you a bit of a flavour as to what it can be like working underground, because it is quite a strange environment, especially if you've never spent any time in an underground environment before. It's a very, very unique, very special place to be. So as I mentioned, that decision between whether you have an open pit mine or an underground mine traditionally certainly was all about money. But increasingly so, of course, it is moving into the realm where we do look at things from an environment, social and governance perspective, and some of this we'll investigate in a bit more detail next week. And that's because, of course, as well, between your surface mining and your underground mining, they're very different approaches. Underground mining does tend to be much more expensive, but it does reduce things like that surface footprint that people can see, for example, from outside of the mining area. Now, I've been talking about large-scale mining. What about artisanal and small-scale mining? Where, well, okay, fine, we don't have big trucks, etc., in the same way in artisanal and small-scale mining, but a lot of the approaches are pretty much exactly the same. It's just using different tools, different techniques. And what I've included here are some of the talks that were pulled together in a conference that was run approximately 2 months ago by Responsible Raw Materials. And these videos are all freely available for you guys to go and watch to learn a little bit more about artisanal and small scale mining and how that maybe compares and contrasts with that large scale mining. And one thing that is common to all mining, it doesn't matter what scale you're looking at, is of course that environmental and that social legacy, which gets wrapped up into that mine closure. Now, ideally, when you walk away from that patch of land, you will have closed it so that it is the same, if not better, than what was there before you even started to extract that rock from the ground. And that's because we are stewards. We are stewards of whatever it is that we are trying to look after. We're stewards of what we're trying to extract from the ground. And as mentioned, we will go into this in more detail next week when we come back together for our responsible mining and sourcing of our materials, and how do we make sure that we really do close those assets in a responsible fashion. Now, once we've extracted our rock from the ground, that then takes us into this world of processing. And there are many, many different techniques that we do in the world of processing. And again, apologies to any engineers that we have on the call. Again, I'm going to very much oversimplify this. But basically, the extent to which you need to process the rock and the minerals depends on what the commodity it is that you're dealing with, and also your end state, your end product that you desire. And we can split our rocks, etc., into bulk. Okay, so that would be things like iron ore and coal. Then we have precious and our base metals. Okay, so that's when we get into our metals, etc. And then we might have things like precious gems, so diamonds, rubies, etc. Now, if we've extracted lots of rock from the ground, the first thing we probably need to do is to smash it up. Okay, and this is where we expend a huge amount of energy within mining, is by smashing rock. And we do it by putting it through various different bits of kit, okay, various different grinders, and we do this for lots and lots of different types of rock. Now, we can then go into the next level of processing, which again is still smashing things up, and it's still separating out our minerals, where we go for the liberation of different minerals. And so, for example, here, as you can see with precious and base metals, usually with the rock that you dig out the ground, less than 5% of it is what you want. The rest of it is just waste. And so the art of a metallurgist is, how do you separate out what you want to keep versus what you want to throw away, okay? And that's a case here where here's a scanning electron microscope image of a piece of platinum ore, and what you can see here is the bit that you want is that bit that says platinum. The rest of it we need to get rid of. So how on earth do you unlock that tiny little piece of platinum from within this? Well, to start with, we use great big mills, and just to show you a quick video of what some mills look like, you can see it's very, very noisy. Okay, these are massive, big tumble dryers, typically within which you will have big balls of metal that will be smashing into rock, or maybe the rock's just smashing into one another. Having smashed the rock up, we then put it through a variety of other tools, techniques, bits of kit to be able to separate out those minerals, etc. further. We then might go into some flotation, and what we do in flotation, again, this is really noisy. Basically, we put in some washing up liquids and some different reagents, which then allow different minerals to either stick to the bubbles or not. So that's another form of separation that we have for our minerals. So as you can see, these facilities are huge, okay? This is for a very, very large mine, and they're not necessarily this large, but the kit is large, and what you're trying to deal with here are very large volumes generally of rock. So you go through your liberation, your separation, you might even have a drying phase, but that's all about separating out those minerals from one another so that you can begin to work out what do we want to keep and what do we want to throw away. And in terms of throwing stuff away, that is what goes into our tailings dams. And tailings can take many, many different forms. The special thing about a tailings dam is you don't just build it once and leave it. For tailings, you generally build the initial level, and then you keep building them up so you can store lots within them. And of course, we all know that there's a massive focus on tailings dams around the world at the moment because we have lots of them. We have tailings facilities all over the place, and this isn't all of them. These are just some of those that were reported in recent reporting to the Church of England, as portrayed by a satellite analytics company called Terabotics that's keeping an eye on all of these different tailings dams around the world. So the key thing here with regards to that initial stage of processing is separating out what do we want to keep, i.e. our concentrate, or what do we want to throw away, our tailings, but with regards to the tailings, we need to look after it properly so we don't set ourselves up for a massive failure in the future, or we don't have a big environmental legacy that we're then having to manage in perpetuity. Now, if we go back to the concentrate, because of course that's where our product is eventually going to come from, depending on the commodity, we might then need to do more processing with it. And the general two types of processing either involve chemicals, so hydrometallurgy, or thermal mechanisms, again, by which to extract out the different elements that we want. And we have lots and lots of different types of techniques we can use here. Some of the most common ones are things like electrowinning, and this is where we basically pass currents through the solution in which our elements are sitting, and we are able to form them into things like plates here. So here we have some copper anodes. We might also need to use different techniques to be able to heat things up, for example. So we might need to smelt our concentrate, for example, to be able to separate out the metal that we want and the slag that we don't want. And smelting can look like this, where you have lots of really hot metal coming out of a furnace and you're separating out the two bits that you want, because of course you will get some of the stuff floating to the top and some of the stuff sinking a little bit lower. So you can see here we've got metal at very, very high temperatures coming out of a furnace, or it might look like this. This is what an aluminium smelter looks like. You can see incredibly long sheds within which we have all of the different furnaces sitting here, and you can see there in the heart of that furnace, that is where that reaction is going on at that precise moment in time. So in the world of processing, as I mentioned, there are a huge number of different techniques that we can use, and I've only mentioned a couple of them. We have things like solvent extraction, leaching, precipitation, casting, etc. Lots of things that I haven't even begun to touch. These are absolutely crucial if we're going to be able to get our product out at the end of the day, so something of use to be able to sell to market. And depending on our commodity, this process flow in terms of what steps we follow is going to look different. So for example, if we are in aluminium, okay, that's what we want to produce at the end of the day, working backwards, aluminium is going to be produced in the smelter. But prior to the smelter, it has to go through this massive refinery here between the original mine, which will be a bauxite mine probably, and eventually ending up as aluminium in the smelter. And you can see that these facilities are incredibly large. And the key thing here with this particular alumina refinery is you have things like the red side and the white side, and you can tell why it's called red and white, because of the color that everything has gone, because that's the color of the material when it gets to that particular area, that particular bit of the facility. And it's in something like this where we have a mixture of that hydro, or that the different chemicals being used to try and separate out what you need from the rock, and also heat being able to convert or be able to induce those chemical reactions so you can end up with the product that you actually want. So aluminium goes through this incredibly long value chain in order to be able to get to that end aluminium product, which is one of the reasons why it has such a high carbon footprint, for example, in order to be able to produce some aluminium, because you have to use so much energy in that process to be able to get to that end point. Similarly, something like platinum, again, has this really long value chain and will also have a whole load of byproducts as well as you go through that process. So for example, nickel, cobalt, copper, along with all of the other platinum group elements that you might be able to get out of the same chunk of rock. And this is crucial because mostly when we're mining something, there will be something else of value we will also be able to mine at the same time. So for example, cobalt, you'll have your mining operation, concentrator, you may then go through some leaching, some refining, etc., to be able to end up with that cobalt that will eventually go into something like your phone, okay? But that cobalt will start off as something like this. So it will start off as a rock in which there will be huge amount, hopefully, of stuff like copper, maybe there's some nickel, maybe there's some other useful material in there as well. So when we're doing this and we're trying to design that process flow to extract the cobalt, we're also trying to think, well, what else could we extract of value at the same point in time. So every commodity, every deposit has a slightly different process flow, because no two rocks are created the same. They all have their own nuances that, as engineers, we need to be able to understand what are those nuances, and also how is that rock changing as we're mining through it. Because again, no rock is homogeneous. It's always going to be changing slightly in terms of its properties, because it's a natural process that caused that rock to form. So in closing, and we're almost there, ladies and gentlemen, before we get into our questions, there is huge variation across the mining sector as a whole. I had a conversation a number of years ago when somebody was under the impression that everything goes through a smelter. Well, it doesn't. Only some commodities will need to go through the smelting process in order to be able to get to that end product. Some commodities you can just dig out the ground and you can sell straight away. You don't need to go through any of that processing bit. You just dig it out of the ground and you sell it. Whereas other commodities, you have to go through a huge process in order to be able to get to that end product that is worth something and you can sell onto the market. With all of them, though, you will be needing to to think about all the various inputs and outputs you might need in order to be able to do that mining process as a whole. And it's when you get to this broader scope of things that we suddenly realize that actually things like the environment, social and governance is absolutely crucial to keep an eye on, and in fact put front and center whenever we're trying to mine. And that's at all stages of the mining process. So next week, when we come back, we're going to be taking a proper look at the responsible mining and sourcing of our raw materials. And this is a case here where the secret, as it were, or the method by which we can make sure we do source all of those materials in a responsible manner actually starts all the way back as exploration, because it's an exploration where we see we've got loads of different ways in which we'll be able to extract that rock out the ground, process it, etc. But we need to be cognizant of the fact that actually the ownership of those assets generally changes over time, and the traditional focus on the ore body, on our license to operate, and on our finance will also change as we go through time. But also those time horizons are big. Okay, so it takes a very long time in order to be able to do this. And so if we're truly making sure that we're sourcing all of those minerals and metals in the most responsible manner, we need to be looking throughout the entirety of that value chain. And just to give you a sneak peek into next week, this is something here where what are the big questions that we might be asking ourselves from the different perspectives of geology, engineering, finance, etc. But how about governance? How about environmental? How about social? What are those different big questions that we might be asking ourselves at different stages of mining? And if we can ask ourselves those questions and answer them correctly, then ideally and hopefully we will end up with a much more responsible manner in which we can mine. So you have your resource, which if there's some good stuff in the ground and you've got permission to be able to go and do it, and you've got the funding and the technology to be able to go and do it, you can convert into a reserve. We then go through our project stage, which includes things like our pre-feasibility and our feasibility studies. We might then be able to mine. We've then got that whole processing scheme of things, which then ends up with us being able to ship our products. Sites should be maintained and closed appropriately, no matter at what point in time in that value chain they are being utilized. And of course, products and projects can be sold at all stages. You guys have your introduction to mining fact sheet, okay, which is there for you to use. But before we go into any final questions, we also have a whole load of training courses for you as well. And I think Eamon is going to tell us about them, but your secret loop into them is to make sure that you are a member of Women in Mining. Eamon, do you want to jump in here and be able to tell everyone all about that and how they can get into their training sessions?
Right. Well, thank you very much, Sarah. That was fascinating. I've got a non-technical background, so I am just soaking this all up. But yes, so while we wait, Sarah's going to have a quick look. We've had a couple of questions that have come in through the chat button as well, if you just have a look at the chat button, as well as our group WhatsApp group. Everybody, if you would like to send us your questions, feel free to do so through the Q&A button. I've actually had problems with my Q&A button this afternoon, so you might as well. So we're very lucky, but we have a fabulous training course opportunity for you, and SATARLA is offering discounts for up to 40% off to Women in Mining UK members. So please, you've just seen the screen share of our website. Please go to the member portal of the WIM UK website to view all the details and how to get in touch with SATARLA to get that discount. You do, of course, have to become a member of WIM, which is, again, very easy to do. Feel free to log on and join. It's absolutely free. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah, see if we've got some questions that we can answer.
Yes, and we do, which is absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much, Eamon. And I would encourage you, so what we've given you just now is a whistle-stop tour through some of the high-level bits of the technical aspects of mining. And this is a case here where no question is a silly question, because it's a case where people who have spent their entire careers working in mining still don't know what all the answers are. And I certainly don't know what the answers are. And I will hold my hands up and I will say that, but I will attempt to find the answers for you at some point. But this is a case where if you are interested in understanding more, based on the fact sheet that you saw earlier on, we do run an online training course with regards to this. There are 2 sets of 3-hour sessions on concurrent days, where we can really dive into those specific aspects in more detail. And also as well, we can flex the course so that if there are specific commodities that you are more interested in, that we can take you through, okay, what is the value chain? What is that process flow that those commodities will generally follow? Now, with regards to your questions that have been coming in, and I'm loving the fact that they're coming in via different channels, which is fine. Katrina, apologies if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, asks, what are the key skills a new geologist or a prospective geologist should develop to get a job within the mining industry? And I think that speaking from my own experience, this is something where if you're wanting to work as a geologist, you have to be fascinated by this stuff here. If you don't really like rocks, then being a geologist might not be your best calling. But if you have a geology degree and you decide you don't want to be a geologist, there are many, many other roles that you can do within mining. And so this then, I guess, takes me into the main bit of my answer for you. So if you want to be a geologist, make sure you love those rocks and you are fascinated by them. But you also need to be really interested in all the other stuff that goes on round about it. So if you want to be an exploration geologist, you need to be really good at understanding what could your potential impact on the environment be? What about your interaction in the social context, for example? How do you understand that? But you also need to understand the commercial side of things. So are you looking for commodities that's actually worth anything out there? What about our critical minerals? So for example, we're seeing this massive shift at the moment in terms of energy transition. So gone are the days, not quite yet, but going are the days of oil and gas and coal being our main source of energy. Actually going forwards, the people who produce the raw materials that are needed in things like wind turbines, solar panels, etc., all of that comes from mining. And these minerals and materials have always been in the ground. It's just that we haven't necessarily needed them before. So as a geologist, you need to be quite strategic in terms of thinking, okay, which commodities do I think I might want to become interested in? Because what do I think might need to be mined in the future? Because it's going to take me 10 years to find it and get it to mining stage. So you need to be ahead of the curve with regards to that. And so I think the final thing to say on that is, yeah, be fascinated in the rocks, be fascinated in environment, social governance, etc. Be fascinated in where the commodities markets, etc. are going, but also be able to communicate to other people. As you could probably tell, I could have spent the entire session talking about rocks just now, but I had to rein it in and also speak about the mining and the processing bits, because when you're trying to communicate about your rocks to other people, you need to make it interesting to them. So your communication skills are also key. So hopefully that answers your first question that you've got. We've also got another question around carbon capture and storage or other carbon reduction methods. So are there any mines that operate this at the moment? And the answer is yes. And what we can find, especially for example, in coal mines, for example, you do get people exploring with regards to carbon sequestration and all of those different methods as well. But also using mines as a storage mechanism for carbon. Yep, so that is going on at the moment. I can send you more information on that if you are interested. So thank you very much, Katrina, for your questions that have come in there. I see that some more have come in through WhatsApp as well. And so this question here that's just come in is the mining industry dominated by the large operators? Which is a great question because, of course, I've been focusing primarily on large scale mining. And the interesting thing here is that the vast majority of people in the world who are in mining are actually in artisanal and small scale mining. On a relative basis, very few people actually work in large scale mining on that broad basis. But it, of course, because especially from a UK perspective, and especially from a London perspective, many of us are perhaps involved in the financial side of mining. That finance generally goes into the large scale mining, which is why there is so much chatter about it as well. So this is something here where I really encourage you to go to the Responsible Raw Materials website and go to those videos from the likes of the artisanal mining experts, such as Estelle Levinelli, for example, where she gives an overview with regards to what is artisanal and small scale mining, because it's an absolutely crucial part of the mining industry as a whole. Just in closing, I'm getting warnings now in terms of timing. So we've got another question here that has come in, and this is all about how do we actually make sure that mining is responsible, and how does that fit into ethical investments, etc. So that's a great question. Thank you very much, Joe, for sending that one in. This is a case where, rather than answer that now, Eamon, can I push that question to next week?
Yes, and in fact, we've got two questions that have just come through the Q&A chat. We might just have to push those forward to next week as well.
Mm-hmm.
We're all going to have to tune in again.
Yes, so very, very quickly on this, because I do have another 3 minutes. So with regards to the responsible mining question, I will come back to that next week, because I do actually we have a full session next week that's all around responsible mining and responsible sourcing. But with regards to Alex, in terms of your question around how do new technologies, for example, drones, how can that be received in the artisanal and small-scale mining sector, and which organisations would deal with the support of development in this part of mining? So just in terms of trying to interpret your question, either does artisanal and small-scale mining make use of this technology? Well, actually, increasingly so. You do see all kinds of technologies actually coming into that smaller scale mining, which is really exciting. And actually, you see some practices within the artisanal and small-scale mining that are much better than the large-scale mining side of things. And so this is a case where we are all a continuous sector. And yes, in terms of the use of drones, satellites, etc., it is more used in the large scale rather than the smaller scale mining. But what's really useful with it is you can see how the land is changing. And so therefore the impacts of these different aspects of mining, which is great. With regards to the anonymous attendee who's asked about tailings dams and whether they can be significant reserves, yes, there's huge amounts of material in our old tailings dams. So for example, if you go to Johannesburg, anyone who's been to Johannesburg and seen all those yellow mountains around the city, those are old gold dumps, but they're from when actually our processing of the gold was pretty poor. So now if you go back and you reprocess them, there's a lot of gold that you can take out of them, and you can see people mining them to these days. And that's the same case with a lot of our old tailings dams. You can go back and you can rework them. And the great thing about tailings dams is it's all been smashed up already. So you don't need to expend all of that energy in terms of smashing up rock because it's already finely ground. The big problem though is from an environmental standpoint, you need to be really careful and with how you look after any contaminants which might be housed within those tailings dams. So I shall stop there, Eamon, if that's okay. And I welcome lots and lots of questions for next week and we'll be able to get through more then.
Well, that's perfect. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. That was brilliant. And thank you to the team at SATARLA who are all in the background helping make sure all the tech is working today. So for those of you who are interested, obviously, please feel free to check out SATARLA's website, our website, WIM UK, for all the details. And if this is your first time for joining one of our Women in Mining UK events, this is a volunteer-run, not-for-profit organization, and which promotes the employment, retention, and progress of women in the mining industry. And everyone is absolutely welcome to become a member of WIM UK, regardless of gender or where you are located in the world. So please go to our website and join us now. Membership is free. And before we say goodbye this afternoon, I'd like to leave you with something that Sarah mentioned back in 2016 when she was actually voted one of the global inspirational women in mining. And in her own words, she said, "The mining sector is so necessary. We all need commodities, yet by its very nature is incredibly destructive, as we've seen by some of the pictures. The rocks themselves, the communities, the environment. Does it need to be this way? How can it be improved?" It is those questions, the desire for a better understanding and the opportunity to explore, that attracted me to the mining industry. So join us next Thursday, the 30th of July at 4 p.m. for the second part of this webinar series, where we will explore the world of responsible mining and sourcing of materials. Please remember, registration closes at noon the day before. Please share with your network. And thank you for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Goodbye.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody.